Let me ask you something. If you nearly died, being pulled out of a burning car with your face on fire, and a priest standing over you reading your last rites because the doctors had already given up on you, would you get back in that car 6 weeks after? Most people would say no, and some people would not even think twice before saying no. But guess what? Niki Lauda said yes. But here's the thing. That story about the crash and the comeback and the burned face, that is the version of Lauda that everyone already knows. It has been turned into movies, documentaries, and highlight reels. And because that story is so powerful, it has actually done Lauda a disservice. Because while everyone is focused on what happened to him, very few people ever stop to ask the more interesting question. How good was this man actually at driving a Formula 1 car? Because if you take away the crash completely and just look at the driving, the lap times, the decisions he made, the results he put together, and the way he competed against the best drivers of his generation, you are left staring at something that honestly does not get talked about enough. So let us talk about it. Here is something most people do not know about Niki Lauda. His family had money, real money, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with motorsport. When Lauda told them he wanted to race cars, they did not just say no. They actively tried to stop him, so he went to a bank and took out a loan against his own life insurance policy. He used that money to buy himself a seat in Formula 3. Think about that for a moment. He was betting his financial future, and in a way, his actual life, on a career that his own family had no faith in. He had nothing to show anyone at that point. No results, no reputation, just a belief in himself that was strong enough to put everything on the line for it. That tells you a lot about who Niki Lauda was before he ever sat at the front of a Formula 1 grid. This was not a man who had doors open for him. He kicked them down himself, and when he eventually got his shot at Ferrari in 1974, he walked into that team and started changing how they operated almost immediately. And that is where it starts to get really interesting. Ferrari in the early 1970s was not the smooth operation people imagined. It was messy and emotional, results were all over the place. Car development was inconsistent and hard to predict. Lauda walked in and did something that none of the Ferrari drivers before him had really done. After every single session on track, he would sit down with the engineers and go through the car in a level of detail that was almost unheard of at the time. Not just the car feels unstable at the back. He would tell them exactly which corner it happened in, at what point in the corner, what he thought was causing it, and what he needed them to change. The engineers did not know what to make of him at first. They had never worked with a driver who came into the debrief having already done half the analysis himself. And here is what that produced. In 1975, Ferrari built the 312T in Lauda's hands. That car became the most dominant thing in Formula 1 that year. He won 9 races. He wrapped up the World Championship with 3 rounds still left on the calendar, and the drivers he beat were not small names. Emerson Fittipaldi was the reigning world champion. Carlos Reutemann was widely considered one of the fastest on the grid. Ronnie Peterson, who many believed had more natural speed than almost anyone else racing at the time, could not live with Lauda across a full season. But was it just the car? Was Lauda simply lucky enough to have the best machinery under him? That is a fair question. Here is where the answer comes from. The 1976 season started the way you would expect from the reigning world champion. 4 wins in the first 9 races. A championship lead that was starting to look very difficult to close down. Everything pointed toward a comfortable title defense. Then came the 1st of August, the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. Before the race, Lauda had gone to the other drivers and tried to get it canceled. He told them the circuit was too dangerous for modern Formula 1 cars. The other drivers voted against him. The race went ahead. On the second lap, his Ferrari lost control and hit the barriers. The car caught fire. Lauda was trapped inside for almost a full minute. By the time 4 other drivers pulled him free, he had breathed in toxic fumes. His lungs were damaged and his helmet had partly melted against his face. A priest came to the hospital that night and read him his last rites. The medical team did not believe he would survive until morning. He survived. 42 days after that crash, Niki Lauda got into a Formula 1 car and drove it to 4th place at Monza in Italy. His wounds were still healing. Every time he put his helmet on, it pressed against skin on his face that had not finished recovering. He was bleeding inside his helmet during qualifying, and he was still fast enough to be right in the middle of a world championship fight right. Think about what that actually means. What kind of person performs at that level with a body still recovering from something that should have taken his life? That is not just bravery. That is an athletic and mental ability that very few people in any sport have ever shown. The season ended in Japan. It was raining so hard that visibility on the circuit was almost zero. Lauda sat in the car on the grid, looked at the conditions, and made a decision. He brought the car back into the pits and retired from the race. James Hunt finished third. Hunt took the championship from Lauda by a single point. People called it a surrender at the time. Lauda never called it anything except the right decision. He assessed the risk, decided his life was worth more than a championship, and acted on that. And the interesting thing is that this was completely consistent with how he always operated. Lauda never raced on emotion. He raced on calculation, even when that calculation cost him the biggest prize in the sport. He did not flinch from it. That is not a weakness. That is a level of clarity about yourself that most people never find. If 1976 left any doubt about how good Lauda really was, 1977 removed it completely. He returned to Ferrari knowing the relationship with the team was already broken. He had decided he was leaving at the end of the year, and Ferrari knew it too. He spent the second half of that season racing in an environment where his own team had already mentally moved on from him. He still won the world championship, 3 race victories, the most consistent points total on the entire grid, and the title wrapped up with 2 rounds still remaining. Then, in a move that only Lauda could pull off with a completely straight face, he did not show up for the final 2 races of the season. He had already won everything he came back to win, so he went home. No driver in the history of Formula 1 has won a world championship and then simply not attended the last 2 races of that same season as if it was nothing. Here's the part of the Lauda story that almost nobody talks about properly, and that puts everything else into perspective. He retired from Formula 1 in 1979, walked away and went to build an airline. He came back to racing in 1982 with McLaren because, apparently, running an airline was not quite enough. By 1984, he was 35 years old. His teammate at McLaren was Alain Prost. If you are having a serious conversation about the greatest Formula 1 drivers of all time, Prost is one of the first names that comes up. That season, Prost won 7 races, Lauda won 5. In qualifying, Prost was faster at almost every single round, and yet at the end of the year, Lauda was world champion. He won it by half a point, the smallest margin in the entire history of the sport. While Prost was producing brilliant qualifying laps, Lauda was converting every Sunday into points with a consistency that across the full year was just slightly better. A 35-year-old man who had already retired once, in cars that had changed enormously since his peak Ferrari years, beat one of the most talented drivers the sport had ever seen in a straight fight over a full season. If Lauda was not genuinely one of the best to ever do it, how do you explain that? Lauda was not the kind of driver who set the world on fire in qualifying. He was not the one producing one spectacular lap that left everyone else looking slow. That was not his game. What he did better than almost anyone was race. From the moment the lights went out to the moment he crossed the line, his ability to judge exactly how hard to push, when to protect his tires, and when the gap he already had was enough, was as good as any driver in the history of the sport. He was also almost impossible to unsettle. In a period when Formula 1 was far more dangerous than it is today, Lauda barely ever made mistakes under pressure. He was not interested in drama on the track. He was interested in points and results. He thought several moves ahead at all times, and journalists of that era often described him as the least emotional driver at the front of the grid. Not because the pressure did not reach him, but because he had made sure it never showed up in his driving. 3 world championships, 9 seasons of front-running performance, a track record against his teammates, including Regazzoni, Reutemann, and Alain Prost that holds up under real scrutiny, a technical mind that reshaped how Ferrari worked, and all of this in an era when Formula 1 was still regularly taking lives. The crash made him famous. The comeback made him the subject of films for decades. But remove all of that and just look at the career from beginning to end. What you are left with is a driver who, at his peak, was controlling Formula 1 seasons with a quiet and calculated precision that very few people before or after him have ever matched. The question was how good Niki Lauda was in his prime, actually. The answer is that he was frighteningly good, and the reason most people do not fully understand that is that they are too busy watching the crash to watch the racing. The racing was the real story all along.